I could give. An empty life was all I had to offer, and yet it was a priceless gift to me. The bitter mark of sin will never fade away, but I can come before Him unashamed. I stand redeemed by the blood of the Lamb. I stand redeemed before the great I Am. When He looks at me, He sees the nail-scarred hand that bought my liberty. I stand redeemed.
Be gathered together as children of God. And more over the world, it's getting to be on the negative side. I'm getting letters now from certain parts of the Philippines, the Islamic religion that has crept in there for the past number of years. Now they're coming out, creating all kinds of terrorist attacks and such against the other Filipino people and disrupting the whole process of their economy. And the one pastor from one of the islands, Brother Jackson, says, pray for us. Things are bad here, especially on our little children. Brothers and sisters, the Islamic belief, a lot of people don't even realize what does it consist of. Well, it started about 700 AD. That is, really began to show itself. It was a competitive religion to Judaism. But by the time we come to the end of the 7th century, going into the 8th century, Islam became a militant type of belief. It absolutely, brothers and sisters, by the sword and spear, it enforced itself in every society. You've studied about the Crusade period. Closing out, come out of 900 and 1000 AD. The Crusader period, there was three phases of that, coming through the 10th, 11th century. It was this strong Islamic belief, led by another leader named as Muhammad the Great. He came rolling out of Saudi Arabia. His militant way eventually took complete control of the Middle East, the land of Palestine, drove the Crusaders back into Europe. He crossed over into the country of Egypt that had already been Christianized from the 2nd century. He threatened to annihilate Christendom in Egypt. He didn't wind up doing that. A lot of the churches was burnt, tore to the ground. And only about 10% of Egypt has remained to have Christian-believing people. The rest are Islamic. Now, why I said this morning, a lot of people go to school today. They don't learn history. They learn portions of it because it's a fact. If philosophers and things of that nature have a tendency to want to, we will say, educate our modern societies, doesn't matter whether you're black, white, red, yellow, or what. They got a way of just throwing certain chapters in the background. Well, that's so far past, we don't need to bring that up to present time. They deal more or less with what's present right now to go on. All across North Africa, this Islamic belief at the point of the sword. It fanned out across North Africa, and by the time we come to 1000 A.D., it has conquered everything plumb to Morocco. And then it heads south in North Africa. The biggest part of North African countries through the 17th century was under the influence of Islam. I get letters from those that are now Christians in these various countries: Ghana, Ivory Coast, Monrovia, Nigeria, and then there's another called Niger. Goes right on, brothers and sisters, into Kenya, Sudan. All of them countries at one time was under the influence of Islam. Now, let me say this in respect, because this is going to some of those countries. And they're all black people, but they're my brothers and sisters. So I'm not saying something or other to belittle. No. But if we're going to be Christians, let's be Christians. If we're going to be some kind of revolutionaries, let's just forget about Jesus Christ. Let's go join some kind of a Bolshevik. Let's get us a gun and a knife or something and start tearing up something. But if we're going to be Christians, let's live like it. But let's don't be ignorant of what's going on. The Islamic belief so dominated North Africa for centuries. Life was cheap. Black to black, it was cheap. There was large territorial areas that was farmable, was run by black masters. Black labor was looked upon as peons. People was taken from villages and traded. And brothers and sisters, for hundreds of years, black labor was cheap in Africa. Well, I never heard that. You never read the right history. And most of those kind of histories have been thrown in the ditch a long time ago. Our modern philosophers have one thing in mind. Let's forget the past, let's build for the future. But the future, brothers and sisters, are going to be full of hell. That's exactly why I read these portions from that writing there of that Jew. The Arab people are not dark black people. In fact, they're cousins to the Jews. Who was Ishmael in the first place? He was Abraham's son, wasn't he? By Hagar, an Egyptian. Soon as Isaac was born, conflict set up. Then from Isaac and Rebekah, here come Jacob and Joseph, and Jacob and Esau. Again, conflict set up. Here's Lot's own two daughters. Incest. They got him drunk. Who were they? In a sense, they were cousins. So the whole Arab world are cousins to the Jewish people. And yet, brothers and sisters, the Arabs look upon the Jews with such hostility. They wish they were all dead. Now, why? Well, brothers and sisters, this book that I hold is the book that God gave through the Jewish nation. A picture and a diagram of eternal life and what He has planned for the world and the nations to come. The Islamic religion knows that, so they had to set in, we will say, a contemporary religion to run parallel. This morning, when I spoke on this, in this video, on this tape, dealing with the Jewish problem first, When we look at the Jewish problem, we've got to look at it from the Bible. All the turmoil we see today, brothers and sisters, is brought about by the devil, who now through political means and intellectual means is seeking to destroy the knowledge of what's in this book. The hour is coming, my dear brother and sister Christian. You are going to be in the minority. You're no longer in America in the majority. You're in the minority. And if time was to last another 50 years, the day will come when America will never be known as a nation that has been Christianized. We will be a society of Buddhists, Hindus, and Islams. But for some reason, in America, there is definitely, and I have to say, it comes from the white side. They're the politicians and they're the leaders. They're the main part of education. They want to undo the past of America. And so for a little bit tonight, I want to read to you parts of the Palestinian National Covenant. Then I'm going to read some more of what this writer says about how Israel ought to look at things. Maybe I better read it first and then read. The culture makers, meaning the new educated bunch of philosophers that concludes the politicians in Israel, renounced the idea of a Jewish state. Now, how would you like to be a young Jew that's been raised up in an Orthodox family? You have finally made your way back to the land that you believe is the land of promise. And after the 6-day war, this land that was taken by a miracle act of God. And as the Bible says, and they will rebuild the ruined places, and the desolate places shall be inhabited. So these Jews, many of them, went into these areas. They began to trace their heritage back. They began to analyze, what tribe did I come from? Well, some of them lived in this area. So they began to volunteer to go into these waste, desolate places that's lay there for hundreds of years, growed up in brush. And they began with their own hands and their own means to build their little homes. 30 years later, scattered through all of that West Bank, are new little houses, bungalows. Most of it is a masonry type structure. But as the politicians are left to, we will say, negotiate the future and the outlook of the nation, it's very evident they've taken up the same idea that the modern philosophers of the nations of the United Nations. We're going to abolish original country borders. If they're allowed to carry it out, the day will come when America will no longer be called America. You will not say you're a citizen of the United States. You will say, I am a citizen of the global order. And I have to say, brothers and sisters, if I did not believe what the Bible says, in the light of time, I'd have to say America will be like living in hell. It will. It will no longer be the nation of freedom. Sure, we've had our areas of poverty, but if you think the rest of the world hasn't had poverty, you ought to get out of your seat and go look at it. I've been there. It's disgusting many times to see how America looks at things. As long as they don't know, they want to know. Well, that's why I'm telling you. I may lose a lot of friends, but so what? I'd rather have God on my side than 40,000 people on my side. Now, to my Jewish friends that this will go to, I want you to know I stand here before my own people. And I'm going to read this from this Jerusalem Post, which I am evident they're just about as liberal as they can be. Otherwise, they wouldn't print this man's book in the manner. And how this man addresses certain things concerning the Jewish state. This man says this: during the early years of the state, intellectuals and academics often accused national leaders such as Ben-Gurion, Moshe Dayan, and Shimon Peres of harboring dictatorial and even totalitarian tendencies. You know why? Because they wanted to believe in the original restoration of all the land of Israel. And with time, this manner of discussing the Jewish national power, which had been a staple of Jewish and Zionist rhetoric prior to the Holocaust, began to regain its previous legitimacy. Thus, Israel's most influential philosophers, a man by the name of Leibowitz of the Hebrew University, had no difficulty calling the Israeli armed forces, listen, how a philosopher discussing the new Jewish national power, which had been a staple of Jewish and anti-Zionist rhetoric prior to the Holocaust, began to regain its previous legitimacy. Thus, Israel's most influential philosopher, Leibowitz of the Hebrew University, had no difficulty calling the Israeli armed forces Judo-Nazis. Now that comes from a Jew writing about Jews that's there to defend their right to be restored back to the land. I speak in defense of the spiritual Jew, not the hypocrite. And declared that Israel would soon be engaging in the mass expulsion and slaughter of the Arab population and setting up concentration camps. Similarly, Jacob Talman of the Hebrew University, Israel's most respected historian, asserted that there is no longer an aim or achievement that can justify 20th century battle. Now, brothers and sisters, in case you don't know the Bible, and since this tape will be going everywhere, the Middle East is getting ready to see one of the most miraculous type of wars that's ever been fought on this planet. In fact, according to Isaiah 60 and Micah the 7th chapter, it's going to shock the world. And I have to say, God hasten the day when it is done. Let the world see that there's a right, that the world may know what is wrong and right. Arguing that Israeli leaders who justified warfare on the grounds of national interest or historical rights were a throwback to the devil's accomplices in the last 2 generations. You believe in that kind of violence, Brother Jackson? I sure absolutely do. You know why? Because all these devils are out to paint a bad picture of something that is right and a good picture of something other that is out of the pit of hell. Keep in mind, brothers and sisters, as the devil controls our young generations today from one end of this planet to the other, the future is dark and dismal because it'll be ruled by hell. He claims that that philosophy is what warped the soul of millions and all but exterminated the Jewish people. By the 1970s, Israel's universities and newspapers had become home to a new generation of intellectuals. Oh, this intellectual picture. The students of Leibowitz, Talmud, and their colleagues, for whom the enormities of World War II were not even a memory, this generation of intellectuals inherited a distaste. They inherit a distaste for the scientists and for the Jewish nationals. But unlike their teachers, they lived in a world in which Zionism had been branded an illegitimate political movement by the General Assembly of the United Nations. And I say to the dogs with them. I won't read no more because I can't control myself from expressing myself. But I got to speak for people. The Jewish people that hunger and cry every day, God, help us. You brought us back. Not to put us in a quart jar and then put the lid on. That's why I read from the Bible this morning. And I will establish you according to your former states. And it's also in the 28th chapter of Deuteronomy, showing the children of Israel then, when you don't do this, I will take pleasure in cursing you. I'll drive you out of the land. I'll scatter you to the ends of the earth. And there, you'll fear for your life. And the Jews today know for hundreds of years, wherever they've been, they have existed at times, brothers and sisters, in such an uncertain era. They did not know whether they would be alive when morning came. Because it says in Deuteronomy 28, when morning comes, you will say, would to God that night was here. And then when the evening comes, you will say, would to God morning was here. Thou wilt fear for thy life. I got the history of the Jewish movement to the New World. Yes, before 1885, yes, there was a small trickle of Jews coming out of coming here by the type of boats they had then. Getting a foothold, surviving, getting established. By the time 1885 came, according to this historian that I've got, in Eastern Europe, Bulgaria, Hungary, Romania, those little places they're caught between the big landmass of Asia and Europe proper. Thousands of Jews, they have been so squeezed into small communities, looked upon by the people where they lived. And it tells how in one area they come around with the idea, that is, the political leaders of those societies. They took all the little boys from 10 years old and down. We're going to educate them. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. They stuck them away in old school buildings. Unheeded. Left neglected. And these little Jewish boys took bad colds, pneumonia. That was the purpose of the nations, to exterminate, using blind ways to do it. And these little boys died with their parents not being able to take care of them. So when the news began to reach through Europe back to them, their areas, they began to plan. And slowly, what belongings they did have, they began to sell. And they began to leave those societies, making their way across the mainland of Europe we will say to the western shorelines of Europe. And then they began to travel across the Atlantic. And it wasn't on luxury liners. It was on old ships, brothers and sisters, that have been converted to almost haul like livestock. And they came through to the New World. They came through Ellis Island. It tells in this book how they were stripped down and examined, tested for diseases and things and such like. And I tell you these things, brothers and sisters, because of stories that have came handed down to me when I was a little boy. Yes, they were looked upon as carpetbaggers. Because in the early years coming into 1900, this went on right up to the very beginning of World War I. From 1885 to 1913, it tells in this history how many thousand Jews had fled that old Eastern Europe area to the New World. Them starting out was slow. It wasn't easy. I remember hearing my daddy tell about when he was a young boy growing up. We're in the years about 1911, 12, 13, just before World War I started. Out of New Albany here came a Jewish man. They called them peddlers. He drove a horse and a covered wagon. What did he carry in the line of materials? Clothing. Boats of goods. He came through the countryside selling goods to the housewife. She needed a new dress. Well, he had it right there. And Dad said many times this Jewish man would make it to get to their house, because they always had a bed, and he stayed all night. He ate at their table, and they put his horse up and fed it. I want to say this to the Jewish people that will hear my voice. Yes, I'm fully aware when many of these Jews came to the New World, they run into all kinds of oppositions from Anglo-Saxon type of people that came here. But don't forget, they were not all haters of the Jewish people. Most of you rude people that lived in the countries, when one of these Jewish peddlers would come around, he was never run off. He was never shot at. He was many times invited in, and he ate at their table. Maybe not been so in the big city metropolitan areas. And that's why, brothers and sisters, in the new world we now live in, there's 7-point-some million Jews living in the United States and Canada. Almost half of the world's Jewish population. That's statistics. That's why I've said, when God gets through cleaning up this country, and He's going to, those Jews that will have to flee the Holy Land when the two prophets are done, and the Antichrist have killed them. That's why it says in the Revelations, and they fled into the wilderness where there was a place prepared there by God. And it says, and they, now who is the they? That means a people that was already there. Now I know what the Assemblies of God teach, and I know what some of the Messianic Jews teach. They said, well, that place is going to be in the wilderness over in the ancient city of Petra. Well, to the Jews that I speak to, let me say this. I've been to that place called Petra. Yes, there used to be a magnificent city there. Population of 200,000 in the great Roman period. But when the trade routes changed, they stopped coming by camel caravans across land. The trade routes began to run along the coastline. Over the period of decades, people left them places in the ancient city of Petra. Today it is nothing but a place for Bedouin people to live. Now, to the Jewish people who think that that is their logical place that they're going to flee to, let me ask you this, to the Jewish people. Let's go from Jerusalem by the way of a helicopter. 80 miles will put you there. Now, if you believe in the war that the Bible speaks of, that the Jewish people are going to wage against Edom, the Moabites, and the Ammonites, and when you read it, brothers and sisters, it tells me the Israeli army is going to literally devastate that country. It's God's way using Israel to throw judgment upon them because of what they did 600 years before the advent of Christ, when they stood on the other side, jumping up and down, having a big time, tell the Babylonians, tear it to the ground, tear it to the ground. Then it'll be ours. Now that's the way the Arabs looked at it then. And I have to say, do you want to go into a place that's been devastated, all the infrastructure is torn to pieces? 3 years after your army has ripped it to pieces and shreds? How many people do you think you're going to feed there? And who is the they that's going to do it? That's why I say, if you think I don't know a little bit about history, forget it. Common sense would tell you. Oh, but God, well, it don't say that in Revelation. It says they, not God going to do the feeding. It's they. They that were already there are going to feed them for 3.5 years. Common sense would tell you. Yes, God could do it. But I have to say, He didn't let the Bible be written like that. So there's a right way to interpret something other, and there's a wrong way to interpret. Yes, logics means one thing, but facts is something else. A lot of people live by logics today. Well, it's logical to think like this. It's logical to look at it. Well, that's the way it goes. Now then, I've read what the modernists, the philosophers, the intellectuals have said. I wish, Brother Jackson, you'd stop at talking about education. Well, if education could show me something other, brother and sister, that made sense. I know what 2 and 2 means. But all this other rhetoric. Now let's see and look at Israel's opponents. Her troublemakers. The people that one day she's going to have to draw back, take a deep breath, and fight them. The Palestinian National Committee. You won't read it in the Courier Journal. No, you get it off of the internet. The as yet unchanged charter of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO. Article 1. Palestine is the homeland of the Arab Palestinian people. It is an indivisible part of the Arab homeland. And the Palestinian people are an integral part of the Arab nation. Article 2. Palestine, with the boundaries it had during the British Mandate, is an indivisible territorial unit. Article 3. The Palestinian Arab people possesses the legal right to their homeland and have the right to determine their destiny after achieving the liberation of their country in accordance with their wishes and entirely of their own accord and will. I also read a history here in Reader's Digest a few years back when the Palestinians was causing Israel a lot of problems in the Intifada. Our Western news media making it sound like that the Jews that went back there just to harass the legal possessors of this land. This historian come back and rebutted that. Said, I'll have to have you to know that up till the 12th century there was very few Arab people even lived in this land. But after the 12th century, all because during the Palestinian period, during the Crusader period, because many Europeans had moved there and had rebuilt some of the coastal cities, this caused international trade from Europe to the west, the west coast of the land of Palestine. When the Crusaders had to leave, the trade routes still come that way and then dispersed. When the Crusaders left, there was very few original people that was left in that land. Only the Arabs that had came in there to fight them. But from the 12th century, all because access to the European lifestyle has now been fed into this society. Out of Saudi Arabia, out of Egypt, even as far away as Algiers, Arab people began to flock here because it was like people here going to Florida or going to California. So from the 12th century, 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th, 1800s, the Arab world has had a lot of time for people from the different parts of the Arab bloc to migrate to this land of Palestine. So the present-day Arab may not altogether be a descendant of the original occupants. If he traces his heritage back, some came from Algiers, some from Libya, you name it, but they all claim to be the original descendants. That's the way the world wants to believe everything. The Palestinian identity is a genuine, essential, and inherent characteristic. It is transmitted from parents to children. The Zionist occupation and the dispersal of the Palestinian Arab people through the disasters which befell them do not make them lose their Palestinian identity. So the Arab wants his identity. And their membership in the Palestinian community, nor do they negate them. Article 5. The Palestinians are those Arab nationals who until 1947 normally resided in Palestine, regardless of whether they were evicted from it or have stayed there. Anyone born after the date of a Palestinian father, whether inside Palestine or outside it, is also a Palestinian. Article 6, the Jews who had normally resided in Palestine until the beginning of the Zionist invasion will be, listen to this, will be considered Palestinians. Now that plays right within this modern concept of the philosophers. How many gets the point? Article 7, that there is a Palestinian community and that it has material, spiritual, and historical connection with Palestine are indisputable facts. It is a national duty to bring up individual Palestinians in an Arab revolutionary manner. All means of information and education must be adopted in order to equate the Palestinian with his country in the most profound manner, both spiritual and material, that is possible. He must be prepared for the armed struggle and ready to sacrifice his wealth and his life in order to win back his homeland and bring about its liberation. The phase in their history through which the Palestinian people are now living is that of national wanton struggle for the liberation of Palestine. Thus, the conflicts among the Palestinian national forces are secondary and should be ended for the sake of the basic conflict that exists between the forces of Zionism and of imperialism on the one hand, and the Palestinian Arab people on the other hand. On this basis, the Palestinian masses, regardless of whether they are residing in the national homeland or in dispersion somewhere else, constitute both their organizations and their individuals one national front working for the retrieval of Palestine and its liberation through armed struggle. Now, I won't read no more, because that might sound boring to a lot of you. But I know when I read that, and those Jewish people play this, they know that we're looking at the problem. Now then, it boils down to this. Is the Bible right? Does God have a right to fulfill it? Does he have the right to carry it out just letter to letter, just the way he said it would be? Sure he does. And I have to believe. And that's why, brothers and sisters, when I read here from the prophet Micah, that's why I said this morning, it's one thing to be devoted in reading the Torah. And I want my Jewish friends to know, I'm not speaking from it derogatory wise. But not everything that God's going to do for Israel is written in the Torah. And if you think that everything is in the Torah is enough to prepare you for the end time, you better run. That's exactly why hundreds of Jews missed the first advent of Christ. They were so took up by tradition, reading the Torah, reading the Torah, reading the Torah. They couldn't see something else coming down the road, and it was what the prophets had said. It told where he would be born. They couldn't see that he was the seed of the woman. They couldn't see that he's the star out of David. They couldn't see those things, and that's in the Torah. But because they couldn't read the prophets or didn't read the prophets, the nation as a whole missed him. They was the one that cried out, "Crucify him!" But there's a few down-to-earth poor people. They had become so sick of the traditionalizing of everything, ritualizing. They'd washed pots and pans till they had wore them out. All of that has a ceremonial aspect. But I want you to know, if your revelation and understanding don't go no further than that, 9 times out of 10 you'll cry many tears wondering, my God, why don't you come to our rescue? Read what your prophet said would be. That's why I go to this little prophet, Micah. A lot of the Gentile teachers never even turned to it. It seems so small and insignificant. So let's turn to it tonight. Now, in this whole 7th chapter, That prophet is speaking to the whole nation of people about them being brought back in the latter days. From the 7th verse down, I like to look, when I read this every time, I see a poor Jew somewhere back in 14th century, 15th century, crying out, "Therefore I will look unto the Lord. I will wait for the God of my salvation. My God will hear me." But I wonder how many Jews back in that period of time ever read this. And then here's that poor Jew. Everywhere he went, he's sneered at, he's jeered at, he's made fun of. And deep down in their heart, they would say, "Rejoice not against me, O mine enemy. When I fall, I shall arise. When I sit in darkness, the Lord shall be a light unto me. I will bear the indignation of the Lord, because I have sinned against him. Until he plead my cause and execute judgment for me. He will bring me forth to the light, and I shall behold his righteousness." And that's in front of them. "Then she that is mine enemy," watch out Germany, watch out Russia, watch out Poland, wherever they've been, and you made life miserable. "Then she that is mine enemy shall see it, and shame shall cover her which said it to me, Where is the Lord thy God? Mine eyes shall behold her. Now shall she be trodden down as the mire of the streets." Meaning Israel will see her own enemy trodden down. God's going to turn the tables. In the day, now, he goes from the people to the end time, right when we will say, God's going to show Israel really. And I have to say, you and me as Christians are waiting for just that very thing. In the day that thy walls are to be built. What walls? People from churches are contributing money to a certain belief, the Third Temple movement. Sure, there's going to be a temple. Sure, it's going to be built. And I was reading in the Jerusalem Post where one Jewish wrote, his idea is for there to be a third temple, God's going to send it down from heaven. No, he's not going to send it down from heaven. And if that Jew that wrote that article would ever to see my video, sure, I'm a Gentile, but I'm a descendant of Abraham by faith. I don't know to believe your Torah, I believe your prophets. I believe everything they said. There's a coming an hour. And the world can't stop it, and there's no philosopher going to stop it. There's not only going to be the building of a temple, there's going to be the rebuilding of old Jerusalem. It's got to go together. In that day shall the decree. Now the word decree here is pointing right back to Deuteronomy 28. It says that he took pleasure in dispersing them, chastising them, and causing them to suffer the things they've suffered. God's got a time factor when he's going to limit this. So I have to say, brothers and sisters, somewhere's in front of the world, already in the mind of God, he's got that day numbered. It's not written here when, but God's got it all in his mind. When that day has arrived, yes, when thy walls are to be built, in that day shall the decree be far removed. In other words, once that's passed, God's not dealing with Israel no more on the merits of Deuteronomy 28. Now then, it's the future, their future. In that day also he shall come even to thee from Assyria and from the fortified cities. This is talking about the Jew. Still out there somewhere in international dispersion. Notice the 13th verse. Notwithstanding, it means however, the land shall be desolate because of them that dwell therein, that is the Arab. Well, part of that has been done away with through the conflicts that's went on in the past. But still, that hasn't brought the city and the temple built. Now, brothers and sisters, let's look at this 15th verse. And I have to say, to the political, philosophical, intellectual Jew that can't believe in a future restoration of your state, your nation, established according to the promises and prophecies of old, you can't read none of this. It don't belong to you. But I'll have to say, your future is very dismal. It's very uncertain. Now then, God promises the real spiritual Jew. That Jew that reaches out is crying, oh God, Lord, fulfill your promise. You've not only brought us back to the land, but Lord, restore everything to us. Now then, let me say this. Have you ever considered, brothers and sisters, the church when it started out was in Jerusalem, made up of Jews. As time went on, a few years later, God opened the door and it began to come to the Gentiles. When it did come to the Gentiles, we received it in its original apostolic truth, doctrinal-wise and every other wise. But in process of time, once God has put it here among the Gentiles, and then he took the Jews out of the land again. It was the Gentiles from the next generations that come on that begin to fail God. They begin to listen to different kinds of teachers, false prophets and this and that. So eventually, by the time we come into the 3rd and 4th century, the church is beginning to drift off course. By the time we come to the 5th century A.D., brothers and sisters, Christianity is now then so weak in Revelation, Satan has absolutely closed the door of Babylon upon it. And from 500 A.D. to 1520, 1,000 years of the devil's millennium. True Christianity and the people that made it up in the different generations that lived, they're locked up in a system of Babylon. Hail Mary. Hail Mary. Beads. Rituals. Relics. Saint this, saint that, Thomas, Andrew this, and on and on and on this thing goes. A whole lot of paganism with certain fundamentals of Christendom blended together. And for 1,000 years, the Gentile church was locked up in Babylon. Then here come the Reformation. And for the next 400 years, brothers and sisters, just as Christendom was brought out, it wasn't restored all of a sudden. We can say this, for the last 400 years, Christendom has existed, scattered, dispersed in denominationalism. Think of it, brothers and sisters, when God began to pick these different men in their era of time to restore a biblical truth. What was wrong with Gentile people? They've been in Babylon. They've heard so much rhetoric, so much tradition. Their mind is blocked. And yes, they could see faith. But somehow or other, they just didn't want to go a bit further. I have to say, as here in these last days of the 20th century, as God slowly has been bringing his chosen people, the Jews, back out of international dispersion to a biblical geographical, to a biblical geographical spot of land. That's the only place he could bless them according to the Word. When we look then at the church, it's comparatively coming the same route. And look at the confusion. Baptists, Lutheran, Episcopals, Methodists, Pilgrim Holiness, Nazarenes, on and United Brethren, on and on and on. They each one got a little biblical truth. And I remember the time, brothers and sisters, when you would hear some of the old-timers talk about The Methodists would look at the Baptists. Do you really think the Baptists are saved? And the Baptists in return would look at the Methodists. Well, I hope so. Now, I say it in that manner. When we did not have a last day prophet to really point us back to a biblical foundation to return to, we were left scattered here and there, hoping we were right, hoping they were right, hoping this and hoping that. And that's why, brothers and sisters, God had to send a messenger in these last days, that he that hath an ear, let him hear, let him come. And I have to say, brothers and sisters, it was joy in my heart, because in Methodism I had questions. But when I heard this man, my questions went out the window. And I began to rejoice. I said, thank God he makes Jesus of the Bible head and shoulders taller than the rest. That's why, brothers and sisters, the church is being dealt with on one hand in a spiritual way, just as Israel on the other hand is in a natural geographical setting. And it's all in the Bible. And I'm thankful to the Lord tonight for that point. Now then, this is what I'm looking at. And I want to close this out to the part of the Jew, According, now the same scriptures here, the same prophets that has told the children of Israel here, and they replied, when mine enemy makes fun of me, you'll be my help and my strength. So here is the end promise. According to the days, or comparatively to the days of thy coming out of the land of Egypt, will I show unto him, meaning Israel, marvelous things. Oh, but the modern philosophers, we don't need that. Yes, you do. And I have to say this. A lot of you modern Jews over there today, if you was to hear my voice, I look at you because I'm a Gentile, but I look at you with deep respect because it's your line of people that God trusted his word to come and eventually reach us. From the call of Abraham to the advent of Christ, you have a historical account there of 1900 and some years. But from the advent of Christ to right now, we too, Gentiles, have a period of time of 1900 and some years that God has dealt with us. Too long, yes, the Jew has looked at us and we have looked back at them. But now then, the church is reaching an end and Israel is reaching the climax. And I have to say, it's no doubt what God from now on does that's going to cause the church and the spiritual people that make up Israel to begin to see how close we are, how compatible we can be, how there can be communication, how we can begin to understand the conflict that we're faced with. So as I finish reading this, the nations, yes, America, England, Germany, Russia, China, Tibet, Burma, all of them shall see. Now imagine, could that have been 500 years ago? No. Well, why not, Brother Jackson? 500 years ago, brothers and sisters, they didn't even have fast means of printing a paper. You know that. Because the printing press wasn't made till 1450. A man by the name of Gutenberg. A tragedy could happen in one nation. It could be 3 months before the news ever got around. But when God says the nations shall see, God knew there'd be satellites. God knew that there would be TV tubes in every home practically, unless you got an anti-religious attitude about one of them. Some people think, oh, they're of the devil. If you allow it to be that way, yes. But if you know when to turn the rotten thing off, they can bring a lot of information into your home. You don't have to wait for it second-handed either. The nation shall see and be confounded. I'd like to see old Bill Clinton get confounded once. I'd like to see him sweat. I would. And his kind. They be confounded at all their might. Oh, look what we got. Yeah. But wait till God gets through with it. When God causes the ignition system on brand new trucks to go bluey. I'll never forget in 1968 when we was over in Israel first time. The two Jewish boys that was our guides, they had fought in that 6-day war. So they said, you know, some of the miracles that took place, said Egyptian soldiers that we captured told us when they left Egypt driving brand new Russian army trucks, coming up to the Sinai, road supply lines to their front, all of a sudden, says everything in the ignition of these trucks went dead. There we sit. And the Israeli planes come over strafing. They jump out and run. Now, I'll say this tonight, brother and sister. If you don't think God's got a key to the whole electrical system that man operates on, forget it. He'll shut your key off one of these days, and you'll never get it started again. Yes. They shall lay their hand upon their mouth. Oh. I like to see Professor Fosdick. I like to see him. Can you tell me what's going on? Mr. Fosdick, you don't believe him, but he's there. Yes, their ears shall be deaf. They shall lick the dust like a serpent. Oh, how humble they can crawl. They shall move out of their holes like worms of the earth. They shall be afraid of the Lord our God and shall fear because of thee. I have to say to the intellectual Jew who would write such derogatory things in their papers, belittling their own national existence, what are you going to do when you too have to hit the dirt and look up one day with tears in your eyes, acknowledging that your philosophy is no good? God's going to rip it all to pieces. They shall lick the dust like a serpent. They shall move out of their holes like worms of the earth. They shall be afraid of the Lord our God and shall fear because of thee. Who is a God like unto thee? There's none. And I have to say tonight, brothers and sisters, God has a right to do every bit of this. And from there on, brothers and sisters, and we'll bring it in the next time, God has a right to do all of these things in these last days. I have to say, he's allowed from Israel to the States to every nation to formulate these modern politicians to adopt this modern philosophy. They're trying to tell the world and convince them there is no God. Let's forget all about this past. And I believe God has, if you can understand my illustration, he has folded his hands because his word's done written. He's just given this element of people the opportunity to carry out, fulfill everything that he has said in his word, whether it's negative or positive. And when he sees that everybody has mentally made their position, made their decision, and they've lined themselves with something, then God will absolutely move. And when he starts moving, he's not going to take 20 years to do it. He'll wrap this thing up, brothers and sisters, in a matter of a few months. He'll set this world on edge. And he's going to make people think on this earth, where in the world have we been all our lifetime? That don't mean there's going to be a worldwide conversion. No. But it means there's definitely going to be some people change their mind. Now, I'll stop speaking on Israel's behalf. Let me go to the America tonight for just a little bit. As I said this morning, I don't enjoy this. I don't. But I know one thing, in the Christian realm, if somebody don't do it, there's people sitting today in their homes, in their church pews, as ignorant as can be, because they hear what ABC and all of these news modern mediums says. But they don't go in depth and tell you everything. Because there's some things today that the modern news media don't want you to know, and they don't want to tell you. Because there is a philosophy from the political background. We want to perpetuate that. We want to put that forth to the people. This is what we want the people to believe. This is what we want them to see. Well, I'm just opposite nature. You tell me one thing, I'll go dig under your woodshed and find out what did you hide. I saw you day before there burying something other. Now that's a figure of speech. You hid something other, you didn't want me to see it. I'm interested in it. And that's the world today. It is. It's a sad picture. Now then, we know this in the last number of years. There's been a tendency from our universities to more or less magnify the picture, the conflict of slavery between the white and the black. As I said this morning, I've talked to too many old-time black people for to be brainwashed that cheap and that way. I have read the stories of the slave traders. You know who they were? They were all Catholics. The Catholic Church looked upon the black man as no more than an animal. Because in Europe, in the 16th century, 17th and 18th century, slavery was quite common. That's history. That they've done took it out of the books. So when it spread to the New World, was only absolutely just an extension of what was already going on. I wished I could speak to my black brothers and sisters and say, brothers, we're living at the end. Let's don't let the devil brainwash us and make us ignorant. I point the finger at every white man that ever drew a whip and put a stripe on a black man's back. He's a devil. And he ought to have been shot. But I also know, and I beg the black people of America today, remember, when they were brought here, America was not an industrial nation. It was an agricultural nation. They were brought here to be workers on farms, cotton plantations. Not a one of them worked in a factory, because there was none. But the men that went to Africa, and let me say this, I've been in Ghana. I preached 3 days in a school building, and in the corner was a big map of the world. And here on a map of the continent of Africa was a big black blotch. And underneath of it, slave trade in this area. Ghana, Ivory Coast, Monrovia. That's where they came from. Now to my brothers that might be black, if you can't trace your descendants back then, you were not a slave. You came here since then. Now don't join the crowd. It's not right for perpetrators to paint a picture that the slaves came to the whole continent of Africa. They did not. Thank God they didn't, because if the Zulu tribe had been here, America wouldn't have existed. Now, if you think I'm talking and stretching it tonight, get the July National Geographic magazine. The writer shows you what the Zulu tribe is doing now in South Africa. South Africa is getting ready to be ripped and torn to pieces and burnt to the ground. And it shows the king of the Zulu tribe in their native habitat. This world is getting ready to be ripped to pieces by people that's been caught up in ignorance. And the biggest part of it is by communism. And they're out to do America the same way. I'm going to ask you a simple question and think seriously. Why is it that Russia has no black problem? Now you go home and think about this. Why is it that China has no black problem? Because the Russians for years said that the black people are subculture people. So I have to say to my black brother and sister, you ought to thank God you're not in Russia. You might be in a jailhouse. You wouldn't complain in Russia nor China. This picture's going to get narrow one of these days, brothers and sisters. I'm not listening to these politicians nor these instructors of education. They're trying to paint the world for our near future. But I say to the black and white, if you want to live with Jesus Christ, brothers and sisters, you're going to have to forsake all. I'll say to any white man, if you can't see what I'm talking about, brothers and sisters, I have no time to waste on you. I won't argue with you. That's why, brothers and sisters, when America was first settled, it was the Catholic slave traders that have already been in the business for years. They came to the New World. They took the sugar cane and converted it to rum, and they went back and traded with the chieftains of the tribes. Haiti. That is an island. That's a territory that is completely black dominated. Back in 1967, when I was in Gastonia, North Carolina, there was a black brother from Haiti. He came in contact with the message that Brother Branham had brought. He had came to the States. He had heard about the church there in North Carolina. He came then, and I sat and talked with him. He told me from his own lips, Brother Jackson, did you ever hear the story how Haiti became so completely dominant black? I said, no. Well, he said when it was first discovered in the New World, the French owned the island. They dominated it. This was how the slaves was introduced to the Caribbean and eventually to the North American continent. The French came from Europe. They opened up these plantations to grow sugar cane. They stayed there. They brought the slaves. They saw that the slaves raised the sugar cane. When the fall came, then the sugar cane is harvested. They converted either to sugar or to rum. When they've sold their market product, big ships come in and they load it on. Then these French celebrities, they leave and go back to France and leave the black people there to care for the land. But they leave them with practically nothing. This went on, went on, and went on. He said, until finally the black people got tired of it. So during one winter course, while the French landowners had went back home, the blacks made up their mind. They made their weapons. They said, in the spring comes when the first boatload arrives, we'll meet them at the harbor. And they did. They did away with them. Good enough for them. But that's all the white wanted to think about their black slaves. They had it coming to them. Boatload after boatload. They just did away with them. Till finally Haiti became completely black dominated. Now I didn't make that up. A black man from Haiti told me this. That's why I tell people, I'm not standing up here beating my gums together just to tell you a story. I've been fortunate and privileged through life to hear this man and that man tell me things. I've heard the horror type, the negative, but I've heard also the positive side. Because I was in the Army with two boys from the Carolinas. They both said their grandfathers owned slaves, but said by what our grandfather told us, they never abused them. In fact, there was a complete compatible relationship went on between the white and black. They lived on the same farm. They ate out of the same garden products. When the Civil War came along and the decree was made by Lincoln that the blacks were slaves was freed. These were blacks on different farms. See, they try to tell you today that all the blacks just took off and run. No, they didn't. They turned to look at their white masters and said, Mister, I was raised here. I don't want to go nowhere else. There's no factories for them to go to. That's why I said America was an agricultural empire. It wasn't not a commercial industrial place. There was no factories to get employment. I'll never forget one morning on the Today program, and this has probably been 12, 15 years ago. From out of the state of Louisiana, a vast white-dominated slave area. Here was this white man. He was in his 70s. He was in with a wheelchair. Here was the black woman pushing him in this wheelchair. She was in 60s. As they interviewed these two, what a beautiful story. She's the last of the black line of slaves. He's the last of the original landowners of the whites. And when they were asked questions, the black woman said, I am of the original line of the black slaves that was there, but said, we lived there. We whites lived on the same plantation. My ancestors are buried there. We were loved. We ate of the same vegetables. When one of us died, they all cried. When one of the others died, they all cried. That's why I said this morning, where is that old song, the darkies? That's the way they referred to themselves. Down in them cornfields. Hear that mournful sound. There was some black people loved their masters. And don't you tell me they didn't pray. They knew how to get down in the cornfield and raise the roof over the church house. Heavenly Father, we need rain. I'd like to speak in some schools, but they wouldn't allow this. But them two southern boys from Carolinas, when they told me how their grandfathers treated their slaves, said, yes, there was white landowners that owned slaves. Said, Grandpa told me, every time they knew that there was a slave coming up for sale, because that man was selling out for some reason, him and some of the others that really knew how to treat their slaves, they'd get together. Look, that old brother Ben over there, you know what kind of a man he is. Talking about the black slave. Look, he's getting old. Lord only knows what will happen to him if they sell him to some other cruel landowner. 3 or 4 of these other farmers would get together and go buy him. Because that was a means of rescuing him out of a future state of tyranny. And once they get him, said, oh, dear brother Ben, look, if you want to live with me a while, you do so. Then you live with George over there a while. This is the way people lived. It's now 100 years ago. But I have to tell you, brothers and sisters, America is going down the drain, because it's just like a piece of paper in a commode. There's a political hand just getting ready to crush the flush button. God have mercy. When I think of the black people that used to go to their churches and sing the beautiful songs of Zion, now then, brothers and sisters, coming back to this case on the Today program, when the white man, he was 70-something, and this black woman did not want to see him have to live in a nursing home. She was the last one of the original black line, and he was the last one of the original white line. And she said, when our children come along, by then little factories and things begin to, rise up, that they could go out and get employment in these little places. She says, as they would marry off and move into town, finally then the plantation got too big for the white ones to take care of, so they would sell off sections of it. Each time they sold off section after section, she says, then some of the whites they would marry off, and they would go this way, and the black would go that way. But said, we're the last of the original. And since he is handicapped, he's got a physical condition, he can't walk. She says, I was the last black girl born on that plantation. And she said, I vowed I'd take care of him. And I have to say, I could cry over something like that. You don't have to be a millionaire to be happy. You don't have to own thousands of dollars. It's just learning how to live right. So, brothers and sisters, America tonight is much in the same situation that Israel is. Now, next Sunday, I'm going to use a comparison. I'm going to take Israel when the miracles, how she won her wars in battle. But I want to paraphrase that. How our statesmen fought our battles, and how many of our statesmen won fame by their loyalty first to God. I want to bring it right on down to the present hour. Where's our statesman today that will fall to his knees and lift his hands to God? Lord, help me to lead this nation. They want to lead it now then just the opposite way. Heavenly Father, tonight I beg of Thee. Lord, my heart goes out as this message would go into different parts of Africa. Lord, you know all about it. Let these words, Lord, fall upon the ears of those that can read between the words that I say and the lines of speech. And Lord, that you'll let them catch a picture of what I'm talking about and looking at. I pray for Israel tonight, Lord. Seeing their philosophers, their politicians, wanting to sell out for the future. And we know, Lord, there's not going to be no future until you take over and you fulfill everything your word has said. Then there will be a future. But there will be a future for those that have an ear to hear, a heart to perceive, to recognize truth itself. Lord, I just pray. Forgive me, Lord, if I've said anything out of context, out of facts or truth. Help us all, Lord, in the hours and the days we live, because we know, Lord, we're living. We can see the end in sight, Lord. This we ask in Jesus Christ's name. Amen.